even at a more fundamental level of today's economic constellation, I think that this notion of real as virtual can help us to critically reject a category which is more and more popular with politically correct post-colonial authors, the notion of so-called alternate or alternative modernity. The idea is, to put it simply, the following one. Of course, there are inconsistencies, antagonisms, repressive potentials in the notion of modernity, which ultimately means, of course, capitalism as the force of modernity. But, so the story goes, these antagonistic, repressive elements are not part of the very concept of modernity, but are only limited to the Anglo-Saxon, West European model of modernization. Why then should there not be other alternate modernities where you can have modernization but without these alienating effects which characterize Western European process of modernization, without socially disruptive processes, without alienation, without exploitation, without ecological catastrophes, and so on and so on. And then, of course, it's free for grab. Anybody can have his or their own modernity. You can say we can have then Latin American modernity as alternate modernity, we can have African modernity, we can have Asian modernity, whatever. So what is the problem with this approach, which is basically an approach of historicist nominalism? Because the underlying logic is that infamous pseudo-deconstructionist logic of there is no modernity as such. There are only particular modernities, like West European, African, Latin American, and so on and so on. Of course, this is true. The problem is elsewhere. The problem is that through this nominalist reduction, again, by claiming that only particular modernities effectively exist, the site of antagonism is reduced to only one particular modernity. It is no longer modernity as such, which is characterized by antagonism imbalance. Imbalance is dismissed as just pertaining to a certain species of, particular species of modernity. And what is problematic with this? Well, to put it very simply, did we not have already in the early 20th century, in the first part of the 20th century, one big, well-known project of alternate modernity? It was called fascism. Fascism was precisely the first big attempt to build an alternate modernity. That is to say, to have the process of modernization, industrial development, and so on, but without paying the price of alienation, social disintegration, and so on and so on. What should we then oppose to this model? We should oppose to it the idea that some antagonism, we can call it by different names. Marxists would have called it, traditional Marxists would have called it class struggle. Frankfurt School would have called it dialectic of enlightenment. But the idea being that there is some antagonistic potential in the very project of capitalist modernity. That is to say that all these phenomena that we deplore, wars, violences, concentration camps, new fundamentalism, you name it, that all this is not simply a regression, or as Habermas would have put it, a sign of modernity as an unfinished project, but is part of the very project of modernity. This is what gets lost. Which is why I think that although it wants to be historicist, critical, this idea of reducing the antagonistic aspects of modernity to just one particular form of modernity is deeply ideological, because it saves unblemished the general notion of modernization. What we should insist on is, on the contrary, as I've just said, that there is an antagonism inherent to the very universal notion of modernity. And now I'm coming to my point, so that the particular species of modernity are not just examples or exemplifications of their universal genius, of their universal notion, but they are in a way reactions to it. They fight it. Modernity as a universal notion names a certain deadlock, a certain antagonism, and particular really existing forms of modernity are attempts to resolve this deadlock, to solve the problem. Liberal capitalism, as one form of modernity, wants to solve the deadlock of modernity in a certain way through market freedoms and so on. Fascist modernization in a different way. Latin American modernization in a different way. So what's properly dialectical here? It's again this very reversal of the usual constellation. It's not that struggle is at the level of the particular content, while universal is just some kind of neutral, empty container. So that universal means some encompassing global notion, and then within this notion particular forms struggle, like fascist modernization against liberal modernization and so on and so on. No, the site of the struggle is universal antagonism itself, and all particular actually existing modernisms are attempts to cover up, resolve this problem. So again, we should remember this, that the site of antagonism is universality. What has this to do with virtual as real? Precisely this site of universality as the site of antagonism is virtual. In what sense? In the sense that there is no universal modernization. It's just a certain virtual constellation of a certain antagonism. All that exists, nominalists are here right, all that effectively exists are just particular forms of modernization. There is no modernity as such. There only is Anglo-Saxon, Latin American, African, and so on, fascist modernity. But in order to grasp the very dynamic of these particular forms, one has to refer them to their absent cause, to the big antagonism to which they react. So again, this would have been another example of how the notion of virtual as real is operative, of how it is a necessary notion if we are to grasp the concrete social dynamic, especially of today's global capitalism.